Miss Marple and the Phantom Footsteps at Dawn. Chapter 1. The Quiet Before Dawn. The village of Willowbrook was never more beautiful than in the first hours of morning. Pale sunlight slid across the thatched roofs, dew glistened upon the hedgerows, and the narrow lane that led past the church and the vicarage seemed bathed in an almost unreal stillness. Only the distant caw of a rook disturbed the silence. Yet, on that particular morning, the stillness was broken in a curious way. Old Mr. Jenkins, the dairyman, was the first to speak of it later. How he had been out at 4 o'clock driving his cart across the green when he had heard footsteps, hurried, uneven footsteps, somewhere in the mist. At first, he thought it must be one of the lads from the inn, stumbling home late. But there had been something different about the sound. A quickness, a kind of desperate rhythm, that made him glance nervously over his shoulder more than once. And yet, when he turned, the road was empty. By 6 o'clock, as the sun climbed higher and the mist began to burn away, the peaceful order of Willowbrook was suddenly shattered. Mrs. Ellison, a widow who lived in the cottage nearest to the churchyard, came rushing into the grocer's, her bonnet askew, her hands trembling. "They've found a man," she gasped, "in the lane by the vicarage hedge. Dead." That single word, dead, spread through the shop like fire on dry straw. Within minutes, it was on every lip, in every whispered exchange. By the time the constable had arrived to secure the scene, half the village had gathered in small knots along the lane, peering through the hedges, inventing their own explanations. The body lay half hidden in the grass, the morning light falling coldly upon his face. A stranger to most eyes, though one or two muttered that they had seen him in the inn a night or two before. His expression, even in death, was oddly strained, as though caught in the very act of listening, to something behind him, perhaps, or to those phantom footsteps that Mr. Jenkins swore he had heard. Miss Jane Marple, sitting primly in her cottage on the edge of the green, heard the news in her own unhurried fashion. Young Molly Carter, the maid from the vicarage, knocked breathlessly at her door to bring the story, her words tumbling over one another in the excitement of scandal. Miss Marple listened quietly, her blue eyes mild behind her spectacles, her knitting needles clicking softly. "How very distressing," she murmured at last. "A man, dead so near the vicarage. One wonders what he was doing there at such an hour." And though her voice was calm, and her hands remained steady upon her work, there was already a thoughtful little line between her brows. For Miss Marple, who had lived in villages all her life, knew that death, when it came unexpectedly, was never quite the simple matter it appeared. And footsteps at dawn, heard and not seen, often meant more than a mere passer-by in the mist. Chapter 2. Whispered Speculations. By mid-morning, the green at Willowbrook looked more like a marketplace than the quiet heart of a country village. Housewives had abandoned their baking, tradesmen loitered with parcels under their arms, and children, sent away at first, crept back to peer curiously from behind stone walls. The police, to everyone's dismay, had already placed a rope barrier across the lane where the stranger's body lay. Constable Perry, perspiring under his helmet, looked both proud and uncomfortable as he waved away the more determined sightseers. "It's murder, that's what it is," declared Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, in a voice loud enough to turn heads. "No man looks like that without foul play. Mark my words, someone in Willowbrook knows more than they're saying." Her friend Mrs. Ellison, still pale from her discovery, pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "I only pray it wasn't one of our own." "Foreign-looking, wasn't he?" put in Mr. Carter, who had taken a bold step closer to the hedge before being shooed away by the constable. "Dark hair, not one of us. Stayed at the inn 2 nights, they say. Alone." Gossip flowed as freely as water over a mill wheel. Each whisper, each half-formed guess, seemed to gain substance as it passed from mouth to mouth. Already the stranger had been a thief, a gambler, a foreign agent, and a runaway husband, all depending on whose ear one bent. At the vicarage, the Reverend Harding tried in vain to maintain a semblance of order. His wife had already given tea to 3 unexpected callers who had arrived, ostensibly to offer comfort, but in truth to pry for details. And through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly in her small parlor, listening as Molly Carter repeated what she had overheard outside the grocer's. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, the tiny gray woolen baby's cap taking shape in her lap. "How strange," she said thoughtfully when Molly had finished. A man in the prime of life, found dead without cause in a peaceful lane. Very strange indeed. Molly leaned forward eagerly. Do you think he was murdered, Miss Marple? The old lady adjusted her spectacles, her gaze far away. People do not, as a rule, fall down and die in hedgerows at dawn, unless there is a reason. And I cannot help thinking of poor Mrs. Ellison. What a shock for her. Such things leave a mark, you know, especially in a quiet life. She paused as though weighing her next words. And then there are the footsteps. Footsteps, ma'am. Yes. Mr. Jenkins heard them, I believe, early this morning. He is not a fanciful man. Uneven, hurried footsteps in the mist. That is not the sort of detail that invents itself. Molly shivered a little. It gives me the creeps, it does. Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost apologetic. Evil, my dear, very often creeps about in slippers rather than boots. Quietly, when one least expects it. Meanwhile, at the inn, Inspector Graves from the county town had arrived, brisk and businesslike. His men were already making inquiries, and the landlord, Mr. Hargreaves, found himself uncomfortably pressed about his mysterious guest. Name of Carston, he said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. Signed the book 2 nights ago. Said he was traveling through business in the north, he told me. Kept to himself mostly. Had a letter yesterday morning, I noticed. Looked troubled after he read it. He did. The inspector frowned. And you have the letter? No, sir. Carried it out with him. Pocket was empty when your constable searched him. A murmur went around the common room, for half the village seemed to have gathered there as well, pretending to linger over pints while their ears stretched towards the questioning. Miss Marple, who had quietly walked down from her cottage, slipped in at the back. She greeted no one, merely took a small chair by the fire and listened, her gentle eyes on the inspector. She looked, as always, like a frail old lady with a basket of knitting. Yet those who knew her well might have recognized the faint alertness in her posture, the way she missed not a single word. The inspector turned suddenly, as though aware of her presence. He inclined his head politely. Miss Marple. Good morning. I dare say you've heard the unfortunate news. I have indeed, Miss Marple replied softly. A very dreadful thing for our little village. Yes. And we must act quickly. Men like Carston seldom travel without some business. I must find out what brought him here. There was a pause, filled only by the creak of chairs and the low murmur of the curious. Then Miss Marple, still mild, still knitting, said in her gentle way, Perhaps, Inspector, it was not so much where he was going, as whom he came to see. Chapter 3. The First Suspect. Inspector Graves wasted no time. By the following morning, his men had pieced together a sketch of the dead man's final hours. Carston, for so he had signed the inn's book, had spent the evening alone in the taproom, drinking a single pint of ale before retiring. Yet several witnesses swore they had seen him again, near midnight, walking along the lane by the vicarage. What business had he there, at so late an hour? The inspector's attention quickly turned to a young man of the village. Peter Lawson, gardener at the vicarage, whose reputation, though not blackened, had its share of smudges. He was known for quick tempers and late-night wanderings, and more than one villager remembered seeing him slip out of the inn the same night Carston arrived. Trouble follows that boy, muttered Mr. Price, polishing his shop window with unnecessary force. His father drank himself into an early grave, and Peter's not much better. Hot-headed, always in debt. By noon, the gossip had grown teeth. Peter Lawson was said to have been seen arguing with the stranger outside the churchyard wall. Someone swore they had heard raised voices. Another claimed Peter had been looking pale and restless that very morning. At the inn, the inspector called him in for questioning. Peter stood tall, broad-shouldered, with dirt still under his fingernails from the vicarage garden. His face was flushed. Whether from labor or indignation it was hard to say. I never touched him, he declared hotly. Yes, I spoke to him. He asked questions, nosy ones, about the Hardings, about the vicarage. I told him it was none of his business, and that was all. Why such hostility? Asked the inspector coolly. Peter shifted. Because I don't like strangers poking about where they don't belong. Willowbrook's our village, not his. The inspector exchanged a glance with his sergeant. And where were you at dawn, Lawson? At home in my bed. My mother will tell you. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in a corner with her knitting, had been permitted, by virtue of her age and general harmlessness, to remain in the room. Now she looked up, her voice quiet. Forgive me, Inspector, but surely Mrs. Lawson would not know whether her son rose early? Young men do not always stay where they ought to, in my experience. Peter turned, his face hardening. Are you saying I'm lying, Miss Marple? She smiled, mild and apologetic. Oh no, dear boy. Only that it is so very easy to be mistaken about such things. I dare say your mother sleeps soundly. The inspector, seizing on her words, leaned forward. You admit you argued with him. You had motive enough. I had no reason to kill him. Peter's voice rang out, startling even himself. I didn't even know the man. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the scratch of the inspector's pen. At last Graves closed his notebook. We shall see what the evidence shows. For the moment, Lawson, you had best remain in the village. As Peter stalked out, shoulders tight with resentment, the villagers watching from the taproom exchanged knowing glances. Already the story was solidifying. Peter Lawson, hot-headed and quarrelsome, had fallen upon the stranger in the mist. The constable himself remarked to a bystander that it all fits neatly enough. But Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, shook her head ever so slightly. She had lived too many years in too many villages not to recognize the pattern. A convenient suspect, a too easy explanation. Human nature, she murmured to herself, is rarely so obliging as to fit neatly into place. And though she said no more, her eyes were very thoughtful indeed. Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The arrest, or near arrest, of Peter Lawson had stirred Willowbrook like a stick thrust into a wasp's nest. The villagers, who only the day before had been united in hushed horror, were now divided into camps. On one side were those who thought it perfectly natural that Peter should be guilty. He was quick to anger, restless, and, as Mrs. Price put it with relish, the sort who'll come to no good in the end. On the other were those who pitied him, particularly the women who remembered him as a tow-headed boy playing marbles on the green. It isn't fair, said Mrs. Harding, the vicar's wife, as she poured tea for Miss Marple. Peter may be impulsive, but he has a kind heart. He wouldn't harm a soul, not in cold blood. Miss Marple, sipping delicately, made no comment. She had long since learned that truth often hides behind kindness, and kindness behind truth. People were not simple creatures to be measured by appearances. Still, Mrs. Harding went on, lowering her voice, there has been talk, you know, about Peter, about debts and perhaps worse. He keeps company with those young men from Marleycombe on Saturday evenings. The kind of company that leads to mischief. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, dear. Mischief has a way of growing larger when it is watered. At that moment the vicar himself entered, looking troubled. I have just come from the inn, he announced. Inspector Graves is pressing the idea that Peter Lawson is our culprit. I fear it may be convenient to believe so. Mrs. Harding clasped her hands. Convenient, Henry? What do you mean? The vicar glanced at Miss Marple before replying. Because a stranger's death unsettles a village. If it can be explained quickly, if a local boy can be blamed, then life may resume its peaceful course. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked. Quite so. But life has a way of resuming upon false foundations. And false foundations, in my experience, tend to collapse. That same evening, as the village settled under the misty veil of twilight, another small ripple of unease disturbed Willowbrook. At the grocer's, Mrs. Ellison, the widow who had first discovered the body, was overheard in urgent whispers with Mr. Hargreaves, the innkeeper. Best not to mention it, she said, her voice low but trembling. If the inspector knew, it might complicate things. Miss Marple, who happened to be selecting a tin of tea at that very moment, allowed her hand to linger on the shelf. She made no sign of listening, yet her ears were as sharp as her needles. Complicate what? She wondered. Later, as she walked home through the lane, she paused near the churchyard gate. The grass had already grown trampled where the body had lain, but something else caught her attention, a faint mark on the earth, half erased by boots and wheels. A curved impression, perhaps from a heel, but not a man's heel. Narrower. A woman's. She bent carefully, her eyes narrowing in the fading light. A woman had been there, near the hedge, around the time of the murder. Yet no one had spoken of such a presence. By the time she reached her cottage, the lamps glowing warmly in the windows, Miss Marple had the beginnings of a thought, a faint suspicion forming like a shadow in the mist. And though the village believed the mystery all but solved, she knew that beneath its thatched roofs and polished teacups, secrets were stirring, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 5. A Letter in the Shadows. Inspector Graves, satisfied that Peter Lawson would eventually break under questioning, returned to the county town for the evening. His men remained in Willowbrook, their presence a reminder of authority, but their minds, like those of the villagers, were already narrowing in on the vicarage gardener. It might have ended there, with Peter's name darkened forever, had not a discovery been made the following morning. Mrs. Sims, the postmistress, came bustling into the inn with a face both pale and excited. "This arrived yesterday," she announced, addressed to the gentleman now lying cold in the constable's office. "But it was missorted. I only found it this morning." The envelope, creased from much handling, bore a bold, slanted script. Inspector Graves had not yet returned, so the constable, awkward and uncertain, placed it on the counter for all to see. A hush fell as the landlord slid it open. Inside was a single sheet, the ink dark and hurried. The words were brief but unmistakable. "Meet me at dawn by the vicarage hedge. You will have your answer then. Come alone." A murmur ran through the room. Dawn by the vicarage hedge, where Carston's body had been found. Miss Marple, standing quietly near the fireplace, felt the faintest tightening in her chest. So the meeting had been arranged. But by whom? The villagers turned as one toward Peter Lawson, who had just entered for his morning tea. His face drained of color at the sight of the letter. "It wasn't me," he shouted before anyone had spoken. "I never wrote that, I swear it." But doubt, once sown, spread swiftly. Even those who had defended him began to murmur uneasily. Miss Marple, however, studied the letter with her keen old eyes. The handwriting was strong, elegant, distinctly feminine. And the phrasing, polite, almost genteel, did not sound like the scrawl of an angry young gardener. Later that day, while others busied themselves speculating, she took a slow walk past the vicarage. Mrs. Harding greeted her warmly at the gate, but Miss Marple's gaze strayed beyond, to the garden path where Peter often worked, and then, unmistakably, to the vicar's study window, half open though the air was chill. Someone within had been watching the lane that morning. Of that she was suddenly, instinctively certain. The letter, the footsteps, the mark of a woman's heel. Together they formed not an answer, but the outline of a deeper, darker question. And Miss Marple, knitting resting quietly in her lap that evening, knew the true mystery had only just begun. Chapter 6. The Women of Willowbrook. If Inspector Graves had been the sort of man to consult Miss Marple, he might have saved himself considerable trouble. But the inspector, like many before him, dismissed her as a well-meaning spinster with a fondness for knitting. And so it was that Miss Marple, without fuss or announcement, began her own inquiries. She did not question directly. That was never her way. Instead, she listened, she observed, and she allowed the natural flow of village conversation to guide her. It was at the dressmaker's, while discussing the hem of a neighbor's skirt, that she first heard Mrs. Price remark upon Mrs. Ellison's curious behavior. "Gone quite pale she has," said Mrs. Price, pinning fabric with brisk fingers, "ever since she found that poor man. But then again, she was seen near the lane the evening before. Taking a walk, she said. Strange time for a walk." Miss Marple only nodded sympathetically, remarking that fresh air could do wonders for one's nerves. Yet her mind, sharp as a needle's point, stored the detail away. That afternoon, calling at the vicarage with a jar of her famous marmalade, she found Mrs. Harding in her garden. The vicar's wife greeted her with unusual warmth. Perhaps a shade too much warmth, Miss Marple thought, for one so often composed. "How dreadful this business is," Mrs. Harding sighed. "To think of a murder here in Willowbrook. Henry hardly sleeps, and I confess I cannot rid myself of the image." Miss Marple's eyes wandered, apparently idly, over the gravel walk, where faint traces of footprints still marked the damp earth. A woman's shoe again, she thought, though she made no comment. "Karsten asked questions, you say?" she murmured. Mrs. Harding hesitated, smoothing her apron. "Why, yes. About the village, the history, the old families. But surely that's natural curiosity." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Quite natural indeed. That evening at the inn, Miss Marple sat with her knitting while the others spoke of the letter that had lured Karsten to his death. Most assumed Peter Lawson's guilt. Some whispered about jealousy, about a girl perhaps at the heart of it. Miss Marple said very little. But as she glanced around the room, at Mrs. Ellison pale and nervous in the corner, at Mrs. Harding trying too hard to appear serene, at Molly Carter flushed with the thrill of scandal, she felt certain of one thing. The letter had been written by a woman. And one of these very women, so ordinary in their chatter and tea pouring, held a secret that could unravel everything. The key, she thought, would not be in what they said, but in the small betrayals of habit, the nervous glance, the slip of a word, the inconsistency unnoticed by others. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime piecing together the small patterns of human behavior, prepared to watch with the patience of a cat at a mousehole. For somewhere in the quiet lanes of Willowbrook, a woman's footsteps echoed still. Phantom footsteps at dawn. Chapter 7. A Shadow of the Past. The following Sunday dawned with a curious tension in the air. Villagers dressed in their best and filed into the stone church, their hymn books clasped like shields. Yet even the familiar rhythm of prayer could not wash away the whisper of suspicion. Miss Marple, seated modestly near the back, observed the congregation with quiet interest. She noticed how Mrs. Ellison avoided Mrs. Harding's eye, how Molly Carter fidgeted through the sermon, and how Peter Lawson sat rigid in his pew, his mother's hand resting protectively on his arm. After the service, the crowd spilled into the churchyard. Instead of the usual exchange of recipes and garden advice, there was only one topic on every lip: Karsten. Who had written the letter? Why had he been drawn to the hedge at dawn? It was then that a careless remark, dropped like a pebble into still water, sent ripples outward. "I heard," whispered Mrs. Price to her neighbor, "that Mrs. Ellison once had a connection in Marleycombe. A man who left suddenly years ago. Some say she was never quite the same after." The neighbor gasped, delighted by the morsel. "Do you mean to say this Karsten?" Miss Marple bent her head as though adjusting her glove, but her ears caught every word. A connection to Marleycombe? That was interesting indeed. Later that afternoon, walking home along the lane, Miss Marple encountered young Molly Carter. The girl, flushed with excitement, could not resist sharing what she had overheard at the inn. "They say Mrs. Harding knew him," Molly blurted. "The stranger, I mean. He came once before, years ago. She was seen speaking to him near the post office. But she told the inspector she had never laid eyes on him until last week." Miss Marple only smiled kindly. "My dear, one must be careful with what one hears. Still," she patted Molly's hand, "truth, like cream, always rises to the top." But as she walked on, her thoughts grew sharper. A forgotten acquaintance of Mrs. Ellison, a whispered meeting with Mrs. Harding, both women tied, however faintly, to the dead man. And then there was Peter, the convenient scapegoat, his temper making him the perfect suspect. Yet his outbursts had always been the outbursts of youth, not the cunning of murder. Miss Marple paused at her gate, gazing across the village green as the last light faded. She felt, rather than saw, the threads drawing together. Old love, hidden shame, and the dangerous power of memory. For in every village, beneath the neat hedges and polished silver, there were secrets. And secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a way of stepping out of the past to trouble the present. Chapter 8. The Second Shock. 2 days after the Sunday whispers, Willowbrook awoke to another jolt. Not as dreadful as murder perhaps, but nearly as unsettling for the peace of the village. It was Mrs. Ellison who raised the alarm again. She had gone out early to hang washing, only to find her back gate wide open and her garden path disturbed, as though someone had passed through in haste during the night. A pane of glass in her scullery window was cracked, and a drawer in her kitchen had been left pulled half open. "Burglary," she declared, wringing her hands. Or worse. He has come back. The inspector's men searched the house but found nothing missing, no valuables disturbed. Yet the drawers had clearly been rifled, and a candlestick knocked clumsily to the floor. Whoever had entered had done so not for theft, but for something specific. And what unsettled Mrs. Ellison most was a single muddy footprint left near the hearthrug. Not a man's boot, but the smaller imprint of a woman's shoe. By midday the village was buzzing. Some said the intruder had been seeking papers, perhaps the mysterious letter. Others whispered that Mrs. Ellison herself knew more than she admitted. At the vicarage, the Hardings entertained Inspector Graves, who had returned in haste. "We must not allow this village to descend into hysteria," he declared firmly. "This burglary, if it can be called such, is likely the work of Lawson, attempting to distract us from his crime." Peter's denial, delivered with hot fury, did nothing to change the inspector's view. But Miss Marple, who had walked over with her knitting bag, noted the look in Mrs. Ellison's eyes, haunted, anxious, and far more fearful than the occasion demanded. Later, as the inspector departed, Miss Marple lingered. "My dear," she said gently, "a woman who leaves her gate unlatched may expect company, and company that comes at night often seeks what is hidden." Mrs. Ellison's hands trembled. "I have nothing hidden, Miss Marple. Nothing at all." But the denial was too quick, too absolute. Miss Marple, who had heard countless denials over teacups and hearths, recognized it for what it was, the defense of one who has everything to hide. And so, as the village whispered of burglary and ghostly intruders, Miss Marple set her mind to a new question. What secret was Mrs. Ellison so desperate to keep, and how did it tie her to the man who had died at dawn? Chapter 9. Threads of Connection. The burglary at Mrs. Ellison's cottage unsettled Willowbrook more than the inspector realized. People who had slept with open windows now bolted their shutters, and even the grocer locked his till at night. Yet beneath the surface fear, gossip ran thicker than ever. Miss Marple, quiet and unassuming as always, listened. She listened at the bakery while buying her currant buns, she listened at the pump while waiting her turn, and she listened at the inn where the talk was loudest. And in all the noise, she began to hear a pattern. 3 women. 3 faint but undeniable ties to the dead man. Mrs. Ellison, the widow, once linked to Marleycombe, where Carston had reportedly spent time. Her fear seemed greater than that of mere burglary. Mrs. Harding, the vicar's wife, rumored to have spoken to him before, though she denied it. Her composure was too perfect, her answers too rehearsed. Molly Carter, the maid, young, impulsive, too ready with snippets of knowledge. She had mentioned things no servant ought to know, unless she had seen or overheard more than she admitted. Miss Marple thought of the letter. Feminine, deliberate, written with a hand accustomed to neatness. Could it be Mrs. Harding, whose writing was known for its grace in parish notices? Or Mrs. Ellison, with her faded but careful hand? Molly too could write, though less fluently. Yet a determined girl might imitate another's style. One afternoon, Miss Marple invited Molly in for tea, under the pretext of mending a tear in the girl's apron. She offered warm scones and let the conversation drift until Molly, flushed with the thrill of being treated as an equal, began to talk. "He wasn't just a stranger," Molly confided, lowering her voice. "I heard him say to Mrs. Harding that he knew something about her past. She told him to leave, but he only laughed. I saw it with my own eyes, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's expression never changed. She patted Molly's hand, thanked her for the help, and went on pouring tea. Yet inwardly, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a piece sliding into place. Later that evening, as she sat by her fire with her knitting, she reflected. Carston had not been wandering aimlessly. He had come to Willowbrook with a purpose, with knowledge that gave him power. Knowledge that frightened at least 2 women, and perhaps all 3. The footsteps at dawn, the letter, the burglary. They were not random events but ripples of a single stone dropped in still water. And Miss Marple, who had seen such ripples before, knew that sooner or later, the stone itself must be revealed. Chapter 10. A Net of Politeness. It was Miss Marple's way never to confront directly. She knew well that truth rarely came when demanded. It came creeping like a guilty shadow when one least expected it. And so she began her net, not of accusations, but of small, well-placed kindnesses. Her first visit was to Mrs. Harding. The vicar's wife received her with the gracious calm of a woman accustomed to order. The drawing-room was immaculate, the tea precisely timed, the cakes just so. Yet Miss Marple noticed the faintest tremor when she mentioned the burglary at Mrs. Ellison's. "So unsettling," Miss Marple murmured, threading her needles. "It reminds me of a case in my own village, an intruder who came not for valuables but for papers. Quite curious, really." Mrs. Harding smiled, but the color left her cheeks. A small sign, perhaps, but Miss Marple noted it carefully. Her next call was upon Mrs. Ellison, who received her nervously, clutching at her apron. Here Miss Marple spoke not of burglary but of widowhood, of losses borne and sorrows carried. She asked no direct questions, but let silence do its work. Before long Mrs. Ellison muttered, "He shouldn't have come here. I told him years ago to keep away." Then, realizing she had spoken aloud, she pressed her lips tight and would say no more. Finally, there was Molly Carter. Miss Marple invited her once again, this time to help with polishing silver. While Molly worked, Miss Marple told a story about a young maid in another household who had once been tricked by a charming stranger and brought her mistress near to ruin. Molly's face changed as she listened, her hands fumbling at the cloth. "I didn't mean to, miss. I didn't think he'd end up dead." It was not a confession, not quite. But it was enough. The girl knew more than she admitted, and her fear was of discovery, not of innocence. By the end of the week, Miss Marple had not accused a single soul, yet each of the three women found themselves more uneasy than before. A word here, a silence there, a memory stirred. Politeness was her fishing line, and already the fish were circling. And as she sat by her fire that evening, the crackle of the logs in her grate, Miss Marple's eyes were sharper than her knitting needles. The truth was drawing nearer. All it needed was one more nudge, one carefully chosen test, and the guilty would reveal themselves. Chapter 11. The Case Against Peter Lawson. Inspector Graves prided himself on thoroughness. He had built his career on eliminating doubt, on presenting a case so solid that no jury dared question it. And in Peter Lawson, he believed, he had found precisely that: motive, opportunity, and temperament. By Tuesday morning, the inspector had summoned Lawson to the inn's parlor, where he laid out his findings with grim satisfaction. "You quarreled with Carston on the very evening before his death. Half the village overheard it. You admit to walking the lane at dawn. And your coat, examined by my men, bore mud consistent with the very patch near the stile where Carston's body was found." Lawson's fists clenched. "I told you. I was there, yes, but I left him alive. I argued, I walked away. He was a devil, stirring up things best forgotten. But I didn't kill him." Graves was unmoved. "Then perhaps you can explain this?" From his pocket he produced a silver cigarette case, dented on one corner. "Found in your shed. Carston's initials engraved. How do you account for it?" The young man's face drained of color. He stammered, said he had never seen it before, that it must have been planted. But the inspector, sensing his triumph, pressed harder. By afternoon, word spread like wildfire. Peter Lawson would be charged. The vicar frowned, the shopkeepers shook their heads, and even Mrs. Ellison was overheard saying, "Well, it had to be someone." Fear turned easily into relief when a name was provided. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her garden with her knitting, was not convinced. She thought of Peter's hot temper, yes, but also of his honesty. He was not clever enough to plant alibis, nor sly enough to weep false tears. And the cigarette case. How very convenient its discovery had been. Too convenient, perhaps. That evening, Miss Marple walked slowly past Mrs. Harding's gate. A faint light glowed from her study, and the silhouette within was bent over paper, writing in a hand that looked, yes, unmistakably, like the loops and curves of the letter found near Carston's body. Miss Marple did not linger, nor did she speak. She simply walked on into the dusk, her mind knitting threads tighter than any wool could bind. The inspector might have his suspect, but Miss Marple knew the story was far from over. Chapter 12. The Lady of the Vicarage. The vicarage at Willowbrook was always a place of calm. Flowers in the borders, bees humming over the roses, the faint sound of hymn practice drifting from the church next door. But when Miss Marple came to call that Wednesday morning, she sensed the calm was more cultivated than natural, like roses forced too early in a greenhouse. Mrs. Harding greeted her with warmth, as always, though her eyes darted toward the study where the curtains had been hastily drawn. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, ushering her in, "you are always welcome. Do sit down. I was just preparing a little seed cake." Miss Marple accepted, her knitting bag tucked neatly by her chair. She let her conversation drift harmlessly over parish matters, the garden club, and a forthcoming bazaar. But then, quite idly, she remarked, "You know, Inspector Graves is so certain of poor Peter's guilt. It reminds me very much of a case I once knew, when evidence was found in just the wrong place, and everyone believed it belonged there. Everyone but one." She did not look up as she spoke, only counted stitches. But she heard it, the faint clatter of a spoon against china, the tiny catch of breath. Mrs. Harding smiled. "Yes, yes, dreadful business. But if Peter is guilty, better it is known quickly, don't you think?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet, sometimes it is not the obvious young man with a temper, but someone quite different. Someone whose danger lies in how very calm they appear." The silence that followed was only a heartbeat long, but it was enough. Miss Marple's eyes, though bent on her knitting, saw the stiffness in Mrs. Harding's posture, the way her hand pressed tightly against the arm of her chair. The vicar himself came in then, genial and unsuspecting, and the conversation turned back to safer ground. But Miss Marple left soon after, declining another slice of cake. On the path outside she paused. The loops of the handwriting, the letter by Carston's body, Mrs. Harding's calm too carefully maintained, all of it wove together. Not proof, not yet, but a thread strong enough to follow. And she thought to herself as she adjusted her hat against the breeze, the inspector is looking for a man's violence. But this is a woman's fear. That evening, Miss Marple sat again by her hearth, her knitting needles clicking steadily. A plan was forming, a test subtle enough to draw out truth, and gentle enough that only the guilty would betray themselves. The trap, she knew, must be baited with something irresistible. And in Willowbrook, gossip was the finest bait of all. Chapter 13. The Rumor in Bloom. In Willowbrook, a rumor was like seed on the wind. Cast at once, and by nightfall it sprouted in every corner of the village. Miss Marple, who understood this better than anyone, set her plan in motion with the gentlest of nudges. It began at the greengrocer's, where she allowed her voice to carry just a little louder than usual. "Such a pity the inspector is so sure of young Peter. Why, I heard he may soon be freed altogether. A new piece of evidence, they say." The woman weighing apples leaned forward at once. "New evidence?" "Oh, nothing certain," Miss Marple said mildly, with her usual modest shrug. "But they do say something was found in that letter, something pointing away from Peter entirely. Perhaps even toward, well, someone else in the parish." By the afternoon, the whisper had changed hands at least a dozen times. In the baker's shop it became, "Peter Lawson to be cleared, real killer suspected among village ladies." By evening, at the inn, it grew further. "Inspector has his eyes on a woman of good standing, perhaps even the vicarage itself." Miss Marple herself, of course, said nothing further. She merely returned to her garden, trimmed her roses, and waited. The next day revealed the first fruits of her work. Molly Carter, the maid, arrived at Miss Marple's gate in a state of high agitation. "It wasn't me, miss. I never touched him, I swear. I only carried a note once, but I didn't know what was in it." Tears spilled freely, and Miss Marple soothed her with tea and gentle words. Later that same morning, Mrs. Ellison was seen pacing by her front window, twitching the curtains, her eyes shadowed with fear. She avoided the market, avoided everyone, as if waiting for a knock upon her door. And at the vicarage, Mrs. Harding received her visitors with an even more brittle serenity than usual. Too much serenity, Miss Marple thought, like porcelain set too close to the fire. The rumor had done its work. All three women were stirred, each in her own way. But one of them, Miss Marple knew, would soon make a mistake, because fear, once roused, was harder to conceal than guilt itself. That evening, as the church bell tolled 8, Miss Marple laid down her knitting and allowed herself the faintest smile. The fish were circling closer. It would not be long before one snapped at the bait. Chapter 14. A slip of the tongue. The village had not known such restlessness in years. The whisper of a new suspect clung to every doorstep, every hedgerow. And while most repeated it with the thrill of harmless scandal, there were a few whose nerves began to fray. Miss Marple, having sown the seed, now kept her eyes and ears open for the first crack. She did not have long to wait. It came on Thursday afternoon at the churchyard, of all places. Mrs. Harding was arranging flowers at the memorial cross when Mrs. Ellison approached, pale and hurried. The two women spoke in low voices, but Miss Marple, lingering nearby to tend the vicarage border, caught more than they realized. "You mustn't worry," Mrs. Harding whispered sharply. "Nothing ties us. Nothing unless someone speaks." Mrs. Ellison wrung her hands. "But the letter, what if it is traced? You don't know what he threatened me with, what he still had, even after all these years." Miss Marple bent lower to her roses, feigning deafness, but every word sank into her mind. The letter, the threat, after all these years. That was no slip of gossip. That was fear laid bare. The moment was broken when Molly Carter came hurrying by with a basket of laundry. She greeted them cheerfully, but her eyes darted between the two women with quick suspicion. And then it happened. Mrs. Harding, turning too quickly, snapped, "Keep your mouth shut, Molly, or you'll regret it." The words rang sharper than the church bell itself. Molly froze, cheeks burning, then ran off without another word. Mrs. Ellison stood speechless. Miss Marple straightened, brushed the soil from her gloves, and greeted the ladies as though nothing unusual had occurred. But inside, her thoughts tightened like a net. The trap had worked. The strongest mask, Mrs. Harding's composure, had cracked at last. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the lamplight soft on her knitting. She did not yet know every detail, but she knew enough. Carsten had held power over these women. Power rooted in secrets they thought buried, secrets he had come to exploit. And now, with the inspector closing in on poor Peter Lawson, Miss Marple saw her path clear. The next step would not be waiting. It would be action, placing herself gently, firmly, where the guilty had no choice but to reveal the rest. Chapter 15. Whispered Confession. Molly Carter had always been lively, full of chatter and cheer when delivering laundry or fetching errands. But after the outburst in the churchyard, her brightness dimmed. She walked quickly through the village now, eyes lowered, shoulders hunched as though afraid to linger. People noticed. People always noticed in Willowbrook. Miss Marple noticed most of all. She let a few days pass, knowing that fear ripens more quickly when left alone. Then, on a cool Saturday afternoon, she sent Molly a note in her neat spidery hand. "Dear Molly, would you be so kind as to help me polish the silver tomorrow after church? My hands grow stiff, and I should be very grateful. Yours affectionately, Jane Marple." The girl arrived promptly, carrying with her the nervous energy of one who half expected scolding. Miss Marple greeted her warmly, set out the silver tea service, and laid beside it the soft cloths and polish. "You do it so much better than I," she said gently. "I always manage to miss the corners." Molly smiled faintly and set to work. For a while, the only sound was the soft rub of cloth against silver. Miss Marple busied herself with her knitting, letting the quiet stretch comfortably between them. At last she spoke, her voice as casual as if discussing the weather. "You know, Molly, people often say foolish things when they're frightened. Poor Mrs. Harding was quite sharp with you the other day, wasn't she? It was unkind of her. But then, people sometimes betray themselves when their nerves are frayed." Molly's hands stilled on the teapot. She swallowed hard, then tried to laugh it off. Didn't mean nothing by it, I'm sure. Miss Marple looked at her kindly over the rim of her spectacles. "Perhaps not. But you saw something, Molly. Something that makes her nervous. And perhaps Mrs. Ellison, too. You are a good girl, I know, but keeping secrets for others can be a heavy burden. The girl's eyes filled before she could stop them. She set down the cloth, twisting it in her hands. I didn't want to get mixed up, Mississippi, truly I didn't. But he, Mr. Carston, he gave me a note to take to Mrs. Harding. Said it was private, and I wasn't to tell anyone. I thought it harmless enough, just an errand. Miss Marple nodded gently, encouraging without pressing. But when I gave it her, she went white as a sheet. Told me never to speak of it, never. And then, Molly lowered her voice. And then he met me later, gave me another letter, told me to slip it through Mrs. Ellison's back door. He paid me for it, too. Not much, but more than I'd ever been given. Her cheeks burned with shame. I thought it was just some matter between them. But when he turned up dead and that letter found near him. Oh, Miss Marple, what if it's my fault somehow? Miss Marple reached across, laying a gentle hand on the girl's. My dear child, you are not to blame. Men like Mr. Carston use people as tools. What matters is that you've told me the truth. You've done the right thing. Relief broke through Molly's tears. She nodded, shoulders shaking, then returned to the silver, though her hands trembled. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her face mild. But her thoughts were sharp and clear. The picture was forming. Carston had been in correspondence with both Mrs. Harding and Mrs. Ellison, using Molly as his unwitting messenger. Letters, threats, secrets dredged up from the past. Yes, it was blackmail as plain as day. And blackmail, Miss Marple knew, was a crime that rarely ended without violence. Chapter 16. Shadows of the Past. Here's the full immersive chapter. Long, atmospheric, and full of dialogue and detail. Chapter 16. Shadows of the Past. The village of Willowbrook lay hushed beneath the soft veil of a September dusk. The harvest fields had been cut, leaving ragged golden stubble that stretched into the horizon. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the scent of peat and oak. Yet beneath the peaceful surface, unease still coiled like a serpent. Too many whispered conversations. Too many glances darted quickly away. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting needles clicking softly. She had listened carefully to Molly Carter's confession, turning it over and over in her mind. Letters to Mrs. Harding. Letters to Mrs. Ellison. A dead man found with a final note near him. Blackmail was as poisonous as hemlock, and just as effective at drawing blood. She set her knitting aside, adjusted her spectacles, and leaned back in her chair. Her face was gentle, almost sleepy, but her mind was alert. She had seen this pattern before, in little paddocks in St. Mary Mead, even during her brief visits to London. Blackmail thrived where secrets were thickest. And in Willowbrook, two respectable women, both pillars of the parish, were at the center of it. The next morning after church, Miss Marple lingered in the churchyard, arranging her gloves with unnecessary care. She did not have to wait long. Mrs. Harding appeared first, tall and still elegant despite her advancing years, her expression composed but her eyes restless. Moments later, Mrs. Ellison emerged from the lychgate, her veil drawn low, clutching her prayer book so tightly the leather creaked. They saw one another, and for a moment each hesitated. Mrs. Harding inclined her head coolly. Mrs. Ellison gave a stiff nod. Then both moved to go their separate ways. Miss Marple intercepted them with a smile. "My dears," she said, her voice mild as ever. "How pleasant to see you both. Do walk with me a little way, won't you? The hedgerows are particularly pretty just now, and I always think company makes the road shorter." Neither could politely refuse, though both looked faintly dismayed. They fell in step beside her, the crunch of gravel underfoot filling the silence. "I was thinking during the sermon," Miss Marple began conversationally, "how very comforting it is to be part of a village. We all know one another's lives so intimately, don't we? Such knowledge can be reassuring. But it can also, I suppose, be a little dangerous." Mrs. Harding stiffened. Mrs. Ellison's hand trembled on her prayer book. Miss Marple pretended not to notice. "Why, I remember in St. Mary Mead," she went on, "there was a poor woman once caught out because of some letters she had written in her youth. Nothing truly dreadful, you understand, but foolish words can be made to seem quite shocking when read aloud to the wrong audience. It was a most distressing business. The poor dear never quite recovered her peace of mind. Mrs. Ellison's breath hitched audibly. Mrs. Harding shot her a warning glance. Miss Marple stopped at the stile that led into the meadow and smiled at them both with perfect sweetness. "I dare say," she said softly, "that the late Mr. Carston might have attempted something of the sort here in Willowbrook. Men of his kind so often do." There was silence, thick, heavy, and full of unspoken fear. Mrs. Harding drew herself up. "Miss Marple," she said coldly, "I hardly think this line of speculation is appropriate." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple agreed gently. "But then, one cannot help but notice how very distressed both of you have been since his death. And poor Molly. Well, I am afraid she has been more burdened than a girl of her age ought to be." Mrs. Ellison gave a faint cry, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Mrs. Harding's hand closed around her arm sharply, as though to steady her. "I shall say nothing further," Miss Marple said, her tone final, "except that truth has a way of finding its path to light. Secrets are rarely safe in villages, and blackmailers rarely stop of their own accord." With that, she excused herself and left them standing at the stile, one pale as chalk, the other rigid with anger. That evening, as dusk deepened to night, a knock sounded at Miss Marple's cottage door. She opened it to find Mrs. Ellison, her face blotched from weeping, clutching her shawl about her. May I come in?" the woman whispered. Miss Marple ushered her inside, set her near the fire, and poured a little sherry. For a long time Mrs. Ellison said nothing, twisting her handkerchief until it was a mangled ball of linen. At last she spoke, voice low and strained. "It was 20 years ago, before I married. She broke off, shaking. "I was foolish. I thought myself in love. There were letters. Very compromising ones. When Carston came to me, hinting that he had copies, I nearly died of shame. My husband would never have forgiven me. My children, what would they think?" Tears streamed down her cheeks. Miss Marple handed her a fresh handkerchief. "And Mrs. Harding?" she asked gently. Mrs. Ellison nodded, choking on a sob. "She too. Different matter, but the same kind of hold. He said he had proof of something in her husband's business dealings. She told me once, years ago, that she feared it might ruin her family if it ever came out. He played us both, Miss Marple, set us against each other with his letters and demands." Miss Marple patted her hand, her expression kind but her thoughts sharp. "Yes, my dear. That is just what such men do. They take the small indiscretions of youth, the follies of pride, and they twist them until they bleed money or worse. It is a vile trade." Mrs. Ellison buried her face in her hands. But someone stopped him. Someone, "Oh, Miss Marple, do you think it was Ada? She hated him, but she wouldn't. She couldn't." Miss Marple did not answer. She only watched the woman carefully, knitting needles idle in her lap. When at last Mrs. Ellison stumbled into the night, Miss Marple sat a while longer by the fire. The truth was clearer now. Both women had reason to fear Carston, both had been paying his price. But which of them, or perhaps some other altogether, had finally paid him in blood? The fire crackled, shadows leaping across the walls. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. The pattern was taking shape. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably, it was taking shape. Chapter 17. The Wrong Suspect. The news spread through Willowbrook like wildfire the next morning. The police had turned their gaze upon Mrs. Margaret Ellison. It began quietly, as such things often did. Inspector Cray, a stout, no-nonsense man from the county, had been making his rounds for days, questioning villagers with the persistence of a terrier. He was competent, but unimaginative. To him, guilt lay where evidence pointed most directly, and evidence, in this case, had begun circling Mrs. Ellison like a hawk. She had been seen slipping into Miss Marple's cottage after dusk. She had looked pale, unsteady. Rumor embroidered itself upon fact until the story became that she had been confessing, and the discovery that she had once received letters from Mr. Carston, letters which Molly Carter now admitted to delivering, was enough in the inspector's mind to seal the case. By Monday morning, Mrs. Ellison's neat little house was watched. Her maid whispered of drawers searched, papers examined, and her mistress questioned for hours in the sitting room. The blinds were half drawn, and no one saw her step outside. In the high street, voices buzzed like bees. "I always said she was too high in the instep," declared Mrs. Price at the grocer's. "Pride goes before a fall, and there's no mistaking it." "Nonsense," retorted Mrs. Wainwright, clutching her string bag indignantly. "She's a lady. I've known her these 30 years. She's never done a wicked thing in her life." "Then why all the secrecy, eh? Why the letters?" Mrs. Price pressed. And so it went back and forth until the whole village was divided into two camps: those who believed Mrs. Ellison guilty, and those who insisted she was incapable of such a deed. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her parlor fire, knitting as serenely as though nothing unusual disturbed the village peace. But behind her pale blue eyes, her thoughts ran swift and sure. The inspector had paid her a call that morning, his manner respectful but brisk. "We have it well in hand, Miss Marple," he had said. "The motive is clear enough. Carston held something over Mrs. Ellison, some old scandal she'd pay anything to keep quiet. She feared exposure, grew desperate, and silenced him. We've found receipts, money she drew from her account on the very days Molly claims to have carried letters. A tidy sum, too. It all fits." Miss Marple had listened, nodding gently, her fingers busy with her wool. "Yes, yes," she murmured. "It does seem quite convincing, doesn't it? Though, if I may say so, Inspector, things that fit too neatly are sometimes arranged so on purpose." He had smiled politely, the smile men give to elderly ladies whose wisdom they do not take seriously. "We shall see. For now, I believe we are on the right track." Miss Marple had merely inclined her head, but once he had gone, she sat very still. She thought of Mrs. Ellison's white face, her trembling hands, the broken voice in which she had confessed her past to her. Such fear, such shame. Yes, she might have wished Carston dead. Many had. But to strike the blow herself? No, Miss Marple did not believe it. Fear made women weak, not murderous. At least, not women like Margaret Ellison. On Tuesday afternoon, Miss Marple put on her neat gray coat and hat, and walked slowly to the Ellison home. The maid admitted her reluctantly, whispering that the mistress is not herself at all. Mrs. Ellison sat in the drawing-room, pale as parchment, her hands clutching the arms of her chair. On the table before her lay a crumpled letter, the ink blurred by tears. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, taking a seat beside her, "you mustn't distress yourself so. These things have a way of growing larger than they are. But truth, in the end, always shows itself." Mrs. Ellison looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. "They think I killed him. They think I struck him down. But I never even saw him that night, Miss Marple, I swear it." "I believe you," Miss Marple said simply. A sob escaped her lips. "But they have proof. The money, the letters. And Margaret Harding will say nothing. She knows he blackmailed her too, yet she will not speak. She's too proud. So it is left on me, and I cannot bear it." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Courage, my dear. Pride often drives people into silence, but silence can be dangerous. Still, I think the truth will out. It always does." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Do not give up hope. Things are rarely so simple as they appear to the police. People, real people, are far more complicated." That evening, Miss Marple attended a small supper at the vicarage. Conversation inevitably turned to Mrs. Ellison. "She looked guilty to me," declared Colonel Reeves bluntly, helping himself to cold beef. "Never trusted her, never did. Shifty eyes. And the way she carried on about her children. Well, guilt makes one think of family, doesn't it?" "Oh, nonsense, Colonel," the vicar protested mildly. "You are too ready to condemn. Poor woman is merely overwrought. I dare say many of us would be under such pressure." Miss Marple sipped her tea, eyes lowered, and said nothing. But she was thinking. Colonel Reeves, with his loud certainty, reminded her of many men she had known in St. Mary Mead. Quick to judge, blind to subtleties. And subtleties were everything. She thought of the letters again. Who had possessed them before Carston? Who might still possess them now? A blackmailer rarely keeps every piece of evidence on his person. Someone else might have seen them, used them, feared them. And then there was Mrs. Harding, so calm, so resolute, yet with eyes that flickered whenever Carston's name was spoken. Was her silence protection of her own past, or protection of someone else? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, unnoticed in the warm murmur of supper conversation. The inspector's case against Mrs. Ellison was neat, tidy, and entirely too simple. And Miss Marple, who knew the crookedness of human hearts, was quite sure neatness rarely belonged to truth. By Thursday, the police were preparing their case. Whispers said Mrs. Ellison would soon be taken into custody. Villagers gathered in little knots, exchanging speculation with a relish they would have denied if accused. Miss Marple, however, prepared a different sort of plan. She knew the time was coming when the true culprit would reveal themselves, not by accident but by a careful little nudge. A trick of psychology. The sort of trick that had often unmasked liars in St. Mary Mead. For truth, as Miss Marple well knew, was like a weed in a garden. It might be smothered for a time, but sooner or later it forced its way to the surface. And she meant to be there when it did. Chapter 18. Tea and Traps. The vicarage hall was seldom so crowded as it was that Thursday afternoon. Tables had been pushed together, laden with sponge cakes, seed loaves, plates of sandwiches curling slightly at the edges. The air smelled of tea, furniture polish, and the faint mustiness of hymn books stacked in the corner. Miss Marple arrived early, her neat gray coat buttoned, her gloves folded in her hand. She always preferred to watch people arrive rather than be watched herself. From her chosen seat, neither at the center of things nor tucked too far into the corner, she could observe the door and every face that came through it. The villagers arrived in twos and threes, their voices low at first, then swelling with the hum of shared speculation. Everyone knew the shadow over the village. Mrs. Ellison, whispers of arrest, and the inspector's growing certainty. That shadow darkened the hall even as the sun streamed through the leaded windows. Inspector Cray himself arrived with a firm step, nodding brusquely to those who greeted him. He was not a man for chatter, but he accepted a cup of tea and stood near the window, surveying the room as though he were conducting a parade. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. He thought himself the one in command here. She knew otherwise. The gathering unfolded as village teas always did. Cakes passed, cups refilled, gossip disguised as concern. Mrs. Price leaned heavily across the table, declaring in a stage whisper that she pitied poor Mrs. Ellison, though one must admit appearances are rather damning. Mrs. Wainwright countered, chin lifted, that appearances can be misleading, and Margaret Ellison is a good woman. Colonel Reeves harumphed into his mustache, muttering that guilt showed plainly enough if one had eyes. Through it all, Miss Marple poured tea, her hand steady, her expression mild. She allowed the tide of conversation to flow around her, storing away every glance, every hesitation. At last, when the talk had reached its noisiest, she set down her cup and spoke with her gentle authority. "It does remind me," she began, "of a sad little matter in St. Mary Mead some years ago. A case of blackmail, you see. The poor man who engaged in it thought himself quite clever. He collected letters, small secrets, just little things, foolish in themselves, but embarrassing if revealed. He pressed for money, and when that failed, he hinted at exposure. And then one day he was found, rather suddenly dead." The voices around her hushed. Heads turned, faces leaned closer. Even Inspector Cray shifted, his brow furrowing. "What happened then?" asked Mrs. Price eagerly. Miss Marple smiled, knitting needles resting in her lap. "Why, the police were convinced the lady whose letters he held must have struck him down. They had evidence, receipts, witnesses, all pointing neatly to her. But it was not she. The truth was far more indirect." She paused delicately, letting the silence lengthen. All eyes were upon her now. "In that case," she continued softly, "the guilty party betrayed themselves by growing too indignant at just the wrong moment. People who are innocent may be distressed, but they do not fear a chance word. The guilty, however, cannot bear even the lightest touch upon their secret. They flare up or grow pale, or attempt too quickly to turn suspicion elsewhere." At this, she allowed her eyes to travel slowly across the room, resting a heartbeat longer on Mrs. Harding than was strictly polite. Mrs. Harding sat stiff-backed, her gloved hands clenched in her lap. She returned Miss Marple's look with one of cold fury, as though daring her to continue. It was only a flicker, but Miss Marple saw it. So did the inspector, though he misinterpreted it. "A neat story, ma'am," Inspector Cray said, his tone faintly indulgent. "But I prefer solid facts to parables. We have more than enough evidence against Mrs. Ellison, and gossip won't change that." There was a murmur of agreement from some corners, but others frowned uneasily. Miss Marple only inclined her head, her expression as mild as milk. "Of course, Inspector," she said sweetly. "And yet I have always found that in villages, truth sits very close to the surface. One has only to look for who fears it most." Her words hung in the air, delicate as spider silk, but they clung. Mrs. Harding shifted in her chair, her eyes darting briefly to the window as though measuring escape. Beside her, Mrs. Price pursed her lips, sensing tension without understanding its cause. Miss Marple took up her tea again and sipped, her face perfectly composed. But inside, she felt the faint tightening of the pattern on her needles, as though the stitches of truth were drawing themselves together. After the tea, when villagers drifted away in little knots of speculation, Inspector Cray approached her. His expression was polite, but faintly exasperated. "You do unsettle them, Miss Marple," he said. "But if you think that glare Mrs. Harding gave you means she's guilty, I'll have to disagree. That woman's as proud as Lucifer, but she's no killer." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Pride, Inspector, is often at the heart of the most desperate acts. But I should not press the matter. The truth, as I said, has a way of rising. One need only wait." He shook his head, half amused, half irritated, and left her standing by the door. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, watching Mrs. Harding step into the twilight. Her shoulders were rigid, her steps too swift, too sharp for a woman of her years. Yes, there it was again, the fear beneath the pride. The trap had been set. The first threads had tightened. And very soon, Miss Marple knew, the guilty party would pull against them hard enough to reveal themselves. Chapter 19. Whispers in the Dark. The morning after the tea at the vicarage dawned sharp and clear, with a kind of brittle sunlight that seemed to expose every cobweb on every windowpane in Rosehill. Yet for all the brightness, there was a weight in the air, the kind that followed when a village had something new to whisper about. By 9 o'clock, Mrs. Jarvis at the grocer's had already repeated her account of Miss Marple's curious remark, half a dozen times, embellishing it with each telling. The remark in question had been simple, barely more than a passing observation about a sound heard when no one was supposed to be walking. But the effect on Mrs. Harding had been impossible for those sharp enough to notice to ignore. Most, however, were not sharp. They were eager instead to grasp at the easier narrative. Mrs. Ellison, flustered, weak, and so very clearly hiding something. By midday, the whisper had grown into something firmer. "Poor woman, but really," Mrs. Jarvis confided to Mrs. Tucker over a pound of flour, "she's been keeping secrets for years. Secrets always come out. Mark my words, she'll crack before long." Inspector Cray, for his part, had heard enough village chatter to convince himself that his instinct had been right all along. "Ellison fits the bill," he told Sergeant Wilkes as they walked the high street, his long stride purposeful. Nervous disposition, evasive answers, an odd connection to Carston through her late husband's dealings. "I'll wager she broke under some pressure we haven't yet uncovered." Wilkes, younger and less sure of himself, ventured a question. "But sir, what about Mrs. Harding? She did look rather shaken." Cray dismissed it with a brisk shake of his head. "Nerves. Nothing more. Women of her age and temperament often let their imaginations run riot. Miss Marple might read something into it, but I'll stick with facts." Miss Marple, of course, had heard every syllable of this exchange. She had been standing quietly by the haberdasher's window, seemingly absorbed in a display of buttons, when the inspector passed by. The faintest of smiles played at her lips. She knew well the habit men in authority had of overlooking what lay plain before them. That blindness had solved more mysteries for her than all the magnifying glasses in the world. That evening, the false lead took firmer shape. A letter, found in a drawer at the Ellison cottage, written in a hand not her own but tucked away beneath old bills, hinted at clandestine meetings with Mr. Carston months before his death. The discovery set the inspector alight with certainty. He had Mrs. Ellison brought in for questioning, and before long the whole village knew. "They've got her," said the butcher to anyone who would listen, wiping his hands on his apron with a flourish. "Always thought she had a look about her. Sad eyes. That's guilt, that is." Miss Marple did not argue, but she did not agree. She simply went about her errands with the same serene expression, pausing now and then to remark on the lateness of the roses that season, or the quality of the bread at the bakery. Only those who watched closely might have noticed the keen gleam in her eye when Mrs. Harding's name was mentioned. For Mrs. Harding, indeed, was unraveling. That afternoon, Miss Marple encountered her in the lane near the post office. Her gloves were mismatched, her hair hastily pinned, and her greeting too loud, too forced. "My dear Miss Marple, such weather we're having. Unsettling, really. Makes one think of storms." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Storms have a way of clearing the air, don't they?" For the briefest instant, Mrs. Harding's smile faltered. Then she hurried on, leaving the scent of lavender water in her wake and the impression of a woman balanced on the edge of something dangerous. That night, Rosehill seemed unusually restless. Dogs barked along the lanes, a door slammed somewhere near the square, and the clock at St. Andrew's struck the hours with a mournful note that carried far in the still air. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting in her lap, let the needles rest as her ears caught a faint disturbance. It was not the ordinary sound of night, no creak of settling beams, no rustle of hedgerows. It was the soft, deliberate tread of footsteps. They were hesitant, pausing often, yet determined, moving down the lane toward the old Harding house. She rose quietly, wrapping a shawl about her shoulders, and peered through the lace curtains. There, in the uncertain glow of a half-clouded moon, she saw a figure. Mrs. Harding, her coat buttoned tight despite the mildness of the night, her face half hidden by a scarf, moved swiftly across the garden. In her hand she carried something small and glinting, a metal box or case. Miss Marple's sharp eyes followed as Mrs. Harding disappeared around the side of the house. A moment later, a faint scraping reached her ears, as though earth were being disturbed. Somewhere across the village, a shutter banged, and the sound seemed to startle Mrs. Harding. She straightened, glanced about with a hunted look, and clutched the box closer to her chest. Then, moving more hurriedly now, she vanished into the shadows at the back of the property. Miss Marple let the curtain fall back into place. Her knitting needles lay silent on her lap, forgotten. The pattern of the night was becoming clearer, threads of fear, desperation, and guilt weaving themselves into a fabric that only she seemed willing to examine closely. But she knew better than to act too soon. A net, once cast, must be drawn in with patience. Tonight had shown her what she needed. The first unguarded crack in Mrs. Harding's composure, the whisper of truth beneath the lies. And yet, as the church bell tolled midnight, Miss Marple could not shake the sense that the darkness still held secrets, that the footsteps she had heard were only the beginning of a far more dangerous dance. Chapter 20. The Net Tightens. Morning came to Rosehill with a strange clarity, the kind that seemed to set the very air humming. The village square bustled more than usual, not with cheer, but with restless talk. Mrs. Ellison's supposed letter had taken root in the gossip like ivy on an old wall, winding its way into every conversation. By breakfast time, the baker's boy had repeated the story so many times it was practically legend. Mrs. Ellison had been secretly meeting Mr. Carston for months, and guilt had finally driven her to murder. At the inn, Mr. Pettigrew shook his head sagely over his morning tea. You can see it in her eyes, poor soul. Guilty eyes, I say. Can't argue with the evidence. But it wasn't her handwriting, young Molly protested from behind the counter, too boldly for her station. And Miss Marple, she didn't look convinced at all. Pettigrew scoffed. That old dear. She sees shadows where there aren't any. The inspector knows what he's about. But the villagers were divided, and division meant gossip. By mid-morning, Rosehill was humming like a hive disturbed. Inspector Cray felt the mood of the village was with him. He sat at the station with the dubious letter on the table before him, his chin raised in satisfaction. Sergeant Wilkes, less convinced, read it again with a frown. "It's thin, sir," Wilkes said. "Not much to it, when you look closely. Just a few phrases that might hint at meetings. And the hand, it isn't hers." Cray waved the objection aside. "Hidden in her drawer, was it not? That alone speaks volumes. We'll press her harder. She's nervous, she'll break. Mark me, Wilkes, we're close to the end." Outside the window, unnoticed by either man, Miss Marple walked slowly past, her head bent, a basket looped over her arm. She gave no sign she had overheard their voices through the open sash. Only the slight tightening of her lips betrayed her thoughts. She knew all too well how quick men like Cray were to seize upon the neatest explanation. But in her long years of listening she had learned, the neatest explanation was rarely the truest one. That afternoon, she paid a call on Mrs. Harding. The house smelled faintly of polish and lavender, but beneath it lingered another note, sharp, metallic like disturbed soil. Mrs. Harding was flustered, her hands never still, folding and refolding a lace handkerchief as though it might give her strength. "My dear Miss Marple," she exclaimed too brightly. "What a pleasant surprise. Do sit down. Tea." "Yes, tea, of course." Miss Marple accepted, her eyes noting the trembling hand that poured, the slight rattle of the cup against its saucer. "How kind," she murmured, settling into the chair. They spoke of trifles, the weather, the roses, the church bazaar. Yet beneath the words, Miss Marple read the strain in every gesture. Mrs. Harding laughed too quickly, her eyes darted too often to the window, as if fearing what might come walking down the lane. And once, when Miss Marple mentioned the inspector's certainty about Mrs. Ellison, Mrs. Harding's teacup paused mid-air before clattering softly back into the saucer. "I dare say the inspector is right," Mrs. Harding said after a heartbeat too long. "Poor Mrs. Ellison. So timid, so secretive. These things build up, don't they?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "But they also have a way of pointing where one least expects. Human nature, you know. So many little patterns, repeated again and again." Mrs. Harding gave a weak smile and turned quickly to adjust the flowers on the table. Miss Marple watched her with eyes that missed nothing, the way her fingers clenched the stems, the almost feverish energy that betrayed a spirit fraying at the edges. By evening, the village had convinced itself anew of Mrs. Ellison's guilt. At the general store, voices rose in knowing tones. "She's done for," muttered Mrs. Jarvis. "Did you see her face this morning?" asked Mrs. Tucker. "Pale as death. That's guilt, that is. Mark my words," said the butcher. "They'll have her in irons by Sunday." Miss Marple, passing with her basket, gave them her usual polite nod. They greeted her with courtesy, but her silence unsettled them. For if Miss Marple was not convinced, then perhaps, just perhaps, the story was not so simple. That night, Miss Marple sat in her little cottage, her knitting idle in her lap. The events of the past days arranged themselves in her mind like the pieces of a puzzle. The letter so conveniently found, Mrs. Harding's late-night excursion with the box, the tremor in her hand at the mention of Mrs. Ellison, and above all, the pattern of human nature, the way guilt expressed itself not in shouts, but in small silences, in the tremble of a voice, the hurried glance. She rose, moving quietly about her parlor, tidying books and arranging flowers. To any who might have looked in, she was the picture of harmless domesticity. But her mind was keen, active, preparing. The time for listening was nearly over. The time for action drew near. The next morning, Miss Marple paid calls, little visits here and there, each seemingly casual. She stopped at the vicarage, where Mrs. Ellison sat with hollow eyes, grateful for a kind word. She paused at the Harding house once more, smiling gently though her eyes searched every corner. She lingered at the grocer's, listening to the hum of gossip without adding to it. And then, with the lightest touch, she began to extend invitations. "A small gathering," she said in her soft voice. "Just a few friends at the vicarage hall. Tomorrow evening. Nothing grand, but perhaps a chance to clear the air. Such an unsettled time, don't you think?" No one thought much of it at first. Miss Marple was always arranging teas and gatherings. Yet her choice of words, her calm persistence, carried weight. By midday, half the village knew of it. By evening, even Inspector Cray, though skeptical, had agreed to attend. Mrs. Harding, when approached, had hesitated only a fraction of a second too long. Then she smiled too quickly. Yes, of course, Miss Marple. A good idea. Clear the air, indeed. Her voice was steady, but her hands twisted in her lap. Miss Marple noticed and said nothing. That night, Rosehill lay quiet under a star-pricked sky. The air smelled of damp earth and autumn leaves. In the cottages, villagers whispered to one another of the gathering to come. Some expected Mrs. Ellison's public disgrace. Others hoped for a final word from the inspector. But in her neat little cottage, Miss Marple smoothed the coverlet on her bed and sat down to her knitting once more. Her needles clicked gently, steadily, while her eyes glimmered with quiet certainty. The net was nearly drawn. Tomorrow she would tug it closed.